The merciless New Mexico sun bore down like Judgment Day itself. Silas Boone tracked the wayward steer across the desert flats, dust caking his beard and the brim of his hat casting the only shade for miles. His eyes narrowed at the distant cottonwood grove where black shapes wheeled against the cloudless sky. Birds don't circle like that, lest there's something dead or dying. I've watched enough vultures to know the difference. The steer's tracks veered north, but something about those circling harbingers pulled Silas toward the ancient cottonwoods. His horse picked its way across the cracked earth, each step stirring tiny dust devils that danced briefly before surrendering to the stillness. As he drew closer, he saw it weren't no ordinary gathering of scavengers. These birds perched patient-like on twisted branches, waiting. When the shape hanging from the lowest limb came into view, Silas felt his insides go cold despite the heat. A woman dangled by her wrists, feet barely brushing the ground, her head slumped forward. Her dark hair hung like a curtain across her face, but the shallow rise and fall of her chest told him life hadn't yet departed. "Sweet, merciful heaven," he muttered, spurring his mount forward. Above her hung a crude wooden sign, its red letters still wet enough to drip like blood onto the parched ground below. "White men show no mercy." Silas dismounted before his horse fully stopped, boots kicking up dust as he reached for the hunting knife at his belt. The blade flashed in the sunlight as he sliced through the ropes. He caught her limp body as it fell, lighter than he expected, like holding kindling instead of flesh and bone. Her skin burned with fever beneath his calloused hands. Up close, her features spoke clear, as written words, Apache. The delicate tattoos at her temples confirmed it, though he needed no such telling. When her cracked lips parted, Silas leaned closer, expecting final words or perhaps a prayer in her native tongue. Instead, her eyes fluttered open for just a moment. The look in them struck him harder than any bullet, not the quick fear of impending death, but the weary recognition of deliberate cruelty. Someone had strung her up not to kill outright, but to let the sun and vultures take their time about the business. The New Mexico territory of 1,877 was no country for mercy. Law stretched thin between military outposts and Apache lands, leaving folks to make their own justice more often than not. Homesteads scattered across the territory like dice thrown by a careless hand, each settler gambling their life against raids and the unforgiving element. Silas lived alone on his weather-beaten ranch, 20 miles from the nearest neighbor who'd look him in the eye. Some called him touched for choosing such isolation. Truth was, isolation chose him the day he returned from hunting to find his younger sister cold in the dirt, victim of a raid he wasn't there to stop. The weight of her absence hung around his neck heavier than any noose. Those days, Apache raids and settler retribution flowed like a river of blood across the territory. Each killing demanded another, until few remembered which crime began the cycle or cared to end it. Silas knew harboring an Apache meant death, if discovered for her certainly, likely for him too. Yet he gathered her broken body into his arms and carried her to his horse. Some choices a man makes without consulting his better judgment. "Steady now," he whispered to his nervous mount as he draped her across the saddle before climbing up behind her. He wrapped her in his coat despite the heat, one arm holding her secure against his chest. The buzzards shifted on their branches, yellow eyes unblinking as they watched their meal being taken. "Not today," Silas told them, voice carrying in the empty air. At the stream crossing, he paused. Fresh cavalry tracks cut through the mud bank no more than a day old, heading west. With the woman still unconscious against him, Silas turned his horse toward the rocky foothills, no sense leaving hoofprints where eager eyes might follow. Back at his two-room homestead, Silas laid her on his bed and set about cleaning her wounds. The task required removing her tattered shirt, revealing more than just the sun's cruel work. An intricate tattoo circled her wrist, markings he recognized from peaceful trading bands that sometimes passed through before the troubles started. As he bathed the rope burns with cool water, she stirred fitfully. Words tumbled from her fever dreams, fragments of Apache prayer mixed with something that sounded to his ears like a name. "Nessa," she murmured. "Nessa Crow." Silas paused, water dripping from the cloth in his hand. Strange name for an Apache woman. He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small wooden carving, a girl with flowing hair, arms outstretched as if running. His sister's likeness, whittled during countless sleepless nights. For the first time since her death, he placed it where another might see it, setting it gently beside the makeshift bed. Night fell across the territory, bringing little relief from the day's heat. Silas dozed in his chair, jerking awake at a sound like steel against leather. The woman stood before him, his own skinning knife pressed against his throat, her other hand braced against the wall for support. Her eyes burned with questions no words could form. Why would a white man cut her down when others had strung her up to die? Silas didn't flinch, didn't reach for the rifle propped nearby. He simply met her gaze and waited to learn which way his mercy would be repaid. Silas Boone's homestead clung to the rocky hillside, like a stubborn memory refusing to fade. The modest structure boasted 2 rooms, divided by a crooked doorframe, a stone fireplace that drew smoke proper on all but the windiest days, and a roof sturdy enough to withstand the hammering summer storms that rolled across the territory without warning. His furniture told the tale of a man who built for purpose, not pleasure, a pine table scarred with knife marks, 3 mismatched chairs, and a bed frame lashed together with rawhide thongs that creaked with every shift of weight. "Reckon you need your space," Silas muttered, more to fill the silence than expecting response. He strung a wool blanket across iron hooks he'd driven into the ceiling beams years back, creating a makeshift wall between his sleeping quarters and the main room. On the woman's side, he placed a clay water jar, strips of dried venison, and clean rags for her wound. Nessa watched his every movement from her place on the straw-stuffed mattress, her eyes following him like a wounded wolf, sizing up a stranger who'd wandered too close to her den. She accepted the bitter medicine tea he brewed from creosote bush and willow bark, but her lips remained sealed against words. For 3 long days, they settled into a careful rhythm that spoke louder than any conversation. Silas worked the ranch from sunup to sundown, mending fences, tending his small garden patch, checking his sparse cattle herd. Each night, he slept on the floor beside the door, Winchester rifle laid across his lap, a silent sentinel between the woman and whatever dangers might come calling. On the 4th morning, Silas found a small deerskin pouch beside his coffee pot, its contents rattling softly when lifted. Inside nestled dried herbs he recognized from trading with peaceful bands before the troubles started, plants that healed fever and fought the corruption that could claim a wounded body. He nodded slightly, understanding the silent acknowledgement of his care. Before heading out to repair wind damage on the north fence line, Silas placed a hand-carved wooden horse near her blanket. The figurine stood no taller than his thumb, its mane and tail flowing as if caught in eternal gallop across some unseen prairie. He offered no explanation, just set it down, and departed without meeting her eyes. The sun had begun its western descent when Silas returned, the scent of simmering meat stopping him at his own threshold. Inside, a simple stew bubbled in his iron pot, strips of his dried venison softened with wild onions, and the last wizened potatoes from his root cellar. Nessa stood by the fireplace, wooden spoon clutched like a weapon. Silas eased himself down against the far wall, deliberately averting his gaze to ease her discomfort. He accepted the tin bowl she extended at arm's length, careful that their fingers didn't brush in the exchange. The silence between them stretched comfortable as old leather until coyotes began their evening chorus just beyond the ridge. Nessa's hand moved instinctively to the knife at her waist, knuckles whitening around the handle. Silas merely continued eating, speaking softly without looking up. "They won't come near while fire burns, just singing to the moon is all." A full week passed before Nessa broke her silence, her voice rough as creek stones from disuse. "Why didn't you leave me there?" The question hung between them, simple yet heavy with all that remained unspoken. Silas continued whittling a small piece of cedar, his knife strokes steady and unhurried. "No creature deserves such death," he answered finally, "man or beast." The wooden shavings curled at his feet like question marks as Nessa studied him, measuring truth against experience. "My people were peaceful traders, she said. We dealt fair with white settlers until a woman was murdered. They blamed us without proof. Her fingers traced the healing rope burns at her wrists, the memory etching new lines of pain across her face. They hung me as bait, hoping anyone who cared would walk into bullet, she explained, watching his reaction carefully. Silas nodded slowly, his weathered face revealing no surprise. Seen such cruelty before, he acknowledged. The admission hung between them like bridge timber over troubled water, not yet a crossing, but the first support of something that might bear weight. The firelight caught in Nessa's dark eyes as she turned the carved horse between her fingers. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding deeper than words could reach. I've survived by hating all white men, seeing them as monsters who slaughtered my family. Yet this scarred, silent man cut me down when others strung me up. Can I trust his unexpected mercy, or will kindness twist to cruelty as it has before? Outside, the desert night settled around the small homestead, stars appearing like distant campfires across the endless sky. Each night I consider slipping away, taking his horse into the desert. But where would I go when both sides hunt me? In this stranger's quiet presence, I've found first moments of peace since watching my people die. Neither spoke again that night, but something fundamental had shifted like sand after wind passes. The wooden horse remained clutched in Nessa's hand until sleep claimed her, its carved form a small talisman against nightmares that had pursued her across the territory. Silas noted this but said nothing, merely adding another log to the fire before returning to his post by the door, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond their fragile sanctuary. The dust cloud rose like phantom smoke on the eastern trail, dancing wild against the morning sky. Silas spotted it from the corral fence, where he'd been mending a broken rail. His heart quickened as he counted the shapes materializing within that telltale haze. 6 riders, moving with military precision. Cavalry. Inside, he hissed, rushing through the cabin door where Nessa sat grinding herbs with a stone mortar. Soldiers coming, no time to argue. He yanked back the frayed rug, revealing the narrow trapdoor of his root cellar, a hollow carved beneath the floorboards, years back when Apache raids had been as regular as Sunday prayers. Nessa moved without question, sliding into the dark space with the fluid grace of someone well-practiced in hasty escapes. Silas replaced the rug, scattering dried mud across it before taking his position at the rough-hewn table, coffee cup in hand and rifle casually propped nearby. The thunder of approaching hooves rattled the cabin's lone window. Silas counted heartbeats until the inevitable knock came, 3 sharp raps with the authority of government steel behind them. Doors unlatched, he called, keeping his voice level as river stones. The man who entered wore the uniform of a lieutenant, dust coating his blue jacket but not diminishing the shine of his brass buttons. His face might have been handsome once, before the sun and whatever memories lurked behind his eyes had carved it into something harder. Lieutenant Elijah Trent, United States Cavalry, he announced, removing his hat with practiced formality that didn't reach his gaze. Tracking an Apache woman. Escaped justice 3 days back. Ain't seen no Indians, Silas replied, taking a deliberate sip from his cup. Just my own shadow for near 2 weeks now. The lieutenant's mouth tightened at the corners. She murdered 2 settler families over by Cimarron Creek. Butchered a child no more than 6. From his jacket, he withdrew a folded paper, creased and weathered from many handlings. The crude sketch showed a woman with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to accuse even from rough charcoal line. Below the image, bold letters proclaimed, $20, reward dead or alive. Don't look familiar, Silas said, pushing the paper back across the table with one finger. Lieutenant Trent didn't touch it. His eyes traveled the cabin's sparse interior, lingering on the blanket hanging across the corner, the second cup beside the wash basin, the women's moccasins Silas hadn't thought to hide. 7 years I've fought Apaches, Trent said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of something that went beyond duty. Lost my brother to them outside Fort Defiance. Used to bring in prisoners regular-like. Believed in the system. A strange smile touched his lips. Command still wants captives when possible. Paperwork's cleaner that way. Silas had seen men like Trent before, officers who'd started with honor but found the frontier wars a forge that twisted principles into vengeance. The lieutenant's reputation had traveled ahead of him to isolated homesteads, how he'd become infamous for returning with more Apache corpses than live prisoners despite commanding orders. "If you spot her," Trent continued, replacing his hat with measured precision, "send word immediately. Some men get confused about where their loyalties should lie in these territories. Best remember which side of the line you stand on, Boone." Only after the cavalry patrol disappeared beyond the ridge did Silas release the breath held tight in his lungs. He lifted the trapdoor, extending his hand to help Nessa climb out. "They won't leave," she said, her eyes fixed on the window. "Look." In the fading light, the distant ridge shimmered with the unmistakable flicker of campfires, the cavalry making camp within clear view of the homestead. No chance now for Nessa to move freely, even after dark. "They mean to watch," Silas muttered. "Wait us out." The next morning brought fresh trouble in the form of Willard Kiefer, Silas's nearest neighbor, arriving unannounced with his wagon creaking up the trail. Silas intercepted him at the corral, while Nessa crouched once more in the stifling confines beneath the floor. "Need to borrow your fencing tools," Kiefer announced, already moving toward the barn where Silas kept his equipment. "Got a break on the north pasture." "Take what you need," Silas replied, positioning himself between Kiefer and the cabin. "I'll fetch them." But Kiefer, never one for patience, pushed past toward the cabin. "Got any coffee boiling? Mighty thirsty ride." Silas's heart hammered against his ribs as Kiefer stomped inside, boots landing heavy on the floorboards right above where Nessa hid. The man's eyes narrowed at the 2 tin plates beside the wash basin. "Expecting company, Boone? Or you taken to eating double portions these days?" "Just ain't done washing up from yesterday," Silas lied, relief flooding through him when Kiefer merely grunted and helped himself to the coffee pot. By the third day of soldiers camped on the ridge, their food stores had dwindled to dangerous levels. Silas couldn't risk hunting with Nessa vulnerable to discovery, and the small garden beside the cabin provided little more than a few withered potatoes and beans. "We'll manage," he told her, dividing the last of the cornmeal into portions that wouldn't keep a sparrow alive. When Nessa's fever came, it struck with the vengeance of a scorned spirit. The rope wounds on her wrists and ankles, seemingly healed, turned angry red with infection. By midnight she thrashed against the blankets, her skin burning hotter than the coals in the fireplace. "Need medicine," Silas muttered, knowing the trading post lay a half-day's ride away. Leaving meant risk, but staying meant watching her die by inches. Dawn found him saddling his horse, determination set in the hard lines of his face. "I'll return before sundown," he promised the barely conscious woman. "Keep breathing till then." Through her fever, Nessa began singing soft, haunting notes in her native tongue. A lullaby, perhaps. Silas paused at the door, the melody striking something in his memory. Without thinking, he found himself humming along, matching the gentle rise and fall of the tune. Nessa's eyes fluttered open, surprise crossing her pain-etched features. "You know this song?" "Learned it years back," Silas admitted. "From a peaceful band that camped near my father's place. They traded fare and sang at night." He continued the melody, his rough voice finding the ancient notes. For the first time since he'd cut her down from that cottonwood, a genuine smile touched Nessa's cracked lips. When the fever finally broke 3 days later, something had changed between them. Nessa sat wrapped in Silas's worn blanket, moonlight filtering through roof cracks to pattern her face with silver. "My name is not Nessa," she whispered. "It is Ayanna. It means peaceful river, my father's wish for my life. He traded with white men, believed peace possible until the day they came for us all." Silas nodded, understanding the gift of truth she offered. "I had a sister," he said, the words scraping his throat raw. "Sometimes I still hear her screams at night. I was hunting when they came. Couldn't protect her then." He looked up, meeting Ayanna's gaze. "But maybe I can protect you." Under that broken roof, with danger circling like wolves beyond their door, they formed a covenant deeper than words. Silas traced a map in the dirt floor with his knife tip. "To the border," he said. "Then south, where neither your people nor mine can reach us." Ayanna's fingers brushed his, sealing the promise. South. Old Samuel arrived the next morning, his mule cart loaded with supplies he claimed to be selling. The ancient tracker had traded with both settlers and Apaches for decades, his weathered face impossible to read. "Cavalry's planning wider search," he murmured as he unloaded sacks of cornmeal. "Bringing men from Fort Stanton, dogs too." Silas kept his expression neutral. "Appreciate the warning." Samuel nodded toward the distant ridge. "They're hunting something precious, I reckon." When the old man departed, he left extra ammunition hidden beneath the grain sacks and a hand-drawn map showing a seldom-used canyon path that led south. At the cabin door, his rheumy eyes held Silas's for a long moment. "Your father would be proud," he whispered, confirming what Silas had suspected. The old man knew exactly what shelter the cabin provided. That evening, Ayanna crafted a small medicine pouch from scraps of leather, filling it with herbs she'd gathered secretly near the cabin. "These plants will sustain us," she explained, demonstrating which desert growth could provide water, which roots would ease hunger when game proved scarce. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, preparing for the journey ahead. As darkness fell, they gathered what little they could carry: food, ammunition, water, and the small wooden carving of Silas's sister. They planned to slip away under cover of night, following Samuel's hidden trail south toward the border. Then Ayanna froze at the window, her body tensing like a hunted deer. "Riders," she whispered. Silas joined her, his blood running cold at the sight of torches approaching far sooner than expected. Lieutenant Trent's second patrol, returning early with reinforcements, and what appeared to be tracking dogs straining at their leads. "We go now," Silas said, reaching for his rifle. "Or we don't go at all." The moonless night hung like a black veil over the New Mexico territory as Silas and Ayanna slipped away from the homestead. They'd packed light, just essentials, strapped to the backs of two horses that stepped careful as cats across the rocky ground. Behind them, they'd left false tracks heading north toward the mountains, boot prints pressed deep where any tracker would spot them easy. "Lieutenant's men will follow those till sunup before they realize the trick," Silas whispered, voice barely carrying above the night breeze. Ayanna nodded, her dark eyes scanning the horizon. "We take the ravine paths," she said. "Horses struggle there. Men on horseback will be forced to dismount or find another way." The narrow game trails cut through the landscape like ancient scars, barely wide enough for a horse to pass. Rocks shifted treacherously underfoot, sending small cascades of pebbles down steep embankments. Twice Silas's mount balked at particularly precarious passages, and twice Ayanna calmed the beast with soft words in her native tongue. Where the path allowed, Ayanna dismounted to walk across flat stones, leaving no prints for pursuers to follow. At every water crossing, she insisted they ride through the shallows for a spell, the current washing away any trace of their passage. "My father taught me these ways," she explained as Silas watched her carefully select their route. "When hunting, leave no trail the deer can read. When hunted, become the wind that passes without mark." By first light, they'd reached a narrow canyon walls so steep they seemed to touch the awakening sky. Silas guided them to a hidden cleft where stone met stone, revealing a small cave mouth obscured by scrub brush. Inside waited supplies: jerky, ammunition, canteens, blankets, all wrapped careful in oilcloth against the elements. Ayanna's gaze fell upon the cache, then rose to meet Silas's eyes with new understanding. "You planned for running long before you found me." Silas nodded once, face impassive as stone. "Man don't survive out here without knowing his escape routes." They rested through the heat of day, venturing forth as evening painted the western sky blood red. The jagged ridge before them offered the only passage south, a bare spine of rock silhouetted against fading light. Halfway across, with moonlight spilling silver over the exposed trail, the night erupted in violence. The rifle shot cracked like thunder in the stillness. Silas felt the bullet before he heard it, a hot slice across his side that sent him stumbling forward. He clutched at the wound, warm wetness seeping between his fingers as Ayanna grabbed his arm. "Down," she hissed, pulling him toward a narrow ravine that cut like a wound into the earth beside them. Another shot splintered rock near Silas's head as they half ran, half fell into the ravine's protection. Behind them, angry voices called out commands, followed by the distant sound of horses being tethered. The ravine's walls stood too close for riders to follow. Mounted, the pursuers would continue on foot. "Apache woman," Lieutenant Trent's voice carried clear in the night air. "Boone, I know you're hit. Surrender her now and I'll see you get proper treatment. You're a white man, I'll speak for leniency if you give up this murderer." Silas pressed his back against cool stone, breathing shallow through clenched teeth. Blood soaked his shirt, but he could tell the bullet had only torn flesh without striking anything vital. Still, the fire in his side threatened to buckle his knees. "They won't follow in darkness," Ayanna whispered, tearing strips from her own shirt to bind his wound. "Not in terrain they don't know." Silas watched her steady hands work with a strange sense of wonder. Never imagined risking death for an Apache. Yet watching Ayanna tend my wound with steady hands, I understand some bonds form beyond reason or explanation, like finding water in desert where none should exist. As night deepened around them, they found shelter in a shallow cave barely large enough for two. Ayanna crushed yucca leaves between smooth stones, applying the fibrous pulp to Silas's wound before binding it tight. From her small medicine pouch came dried prickly pear, which she instructed him to chew slowly. "Keeps the fever away," she explained. "The wound must not get angry." Silas fought waves of pain as Ayanna took position at the cave's mouth, his rifle held awkward but determined in her hands. Though she'd never fired such a weapon, her eyes tracked every shadow with deadly focus. When soldiers' voices echoed too close to their hiding place, Ayanna tilted her head back and gave voice to a coyote's mournful call. The sound bounced from canyon walls, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. She waited, then called again from a slightly different position. The confused soldiers halted, arguing among themselves about which direction to search. As full night descended, their lanterns became distant fireflies moving away toward easier ground. "They'll be back come dawn," Silas managed through gritted teeth. Ayanna nodded, settling beside him to keep watch. "I heard them talking before they discovered us," she whispered. "The lieutenant has sent for more soldiers from Fort Stanton." Silas closed his eyes briefly. "How many?" "2 more companies," she said. "And they spoke of telegrams sent to the territorial governor naming you traitor for harboring me." The gravity of their situation settled between them like a physical weight. What had been a dangerous flight had transformed into something far worse, a territory-wide manhunt with Silas now branded alongside Ayanna. Their small window for escape narrowed with each passing hour. "Rest," Ayanna said, checking his bandage in the faint moonlight. "Tomorrow, we must move faster than before." In the distance, a coyote, a real one this time, answered Ayanna's earlier call, its lonesome voice, a kindred spirit in the vast wilderness that might save or condemn them. The Mexican trading post squatted low against the horizon, its adobe walls the color of dried blood in the fading light. Silas helped Ayanna dismount, his hand lingering at her elbow longer than necessary as they approached the weathered building. The place had stood since before American boots first trod these territories, surviving by serving all who carried coin, regardless of their skin. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight cutting through small windows. The proprietor, Esteban Ortiz, looked up from his ledger, dark eyes widening at the sight of Ayanna's tribal markings. "Senor Boone." He nodded to Silas before his gaze returned to Ayanna. "This woman, she is of the peaceful band that traded here before the Troubles." Ayanna stepped forward. "You recognize my people's markings?" The old trader's fingers trembled slightly as he closed his book. "See, I know them well, and I know also you are not what they claim." He glanced toward the door before continuing. "3 white trappers, they came here after the settler woman was killed, drinking, boasting, not knowing I understood their words. "What did you hear?" Silas asked, voice tight as a new-strung fiddle. "The woman refused their advances. They killed her in anger, then planted evidence at Apache camp." Esteban reached beneath the counter, producing a small silver locket. "They sold this to me, not knowing its worth. Inside hair unlike the dead woman's own." "You witnessed this?" Silas pressed. "With these eyes, senor. The lieutenant's obsession has spilled innocent blood. I will testify, though it may cost me my life." Word travels fast as wildfire in dry country. By sundown, Marshal Hank Talbot had ridden in from the settlement, his silver mustache twitching with displeasure at being summoned. A man who'd worn a badge longer than most had worn boots in these parts. He carried authority in the set of his shoulders rather than the colt at his hip. "Mighty inconvenient timing, Boone," he grumbled, inspecting the locket under the lamplight. His weathered fingers traced an inscription inside its silver case. "Well now, this here belongs to the Hargrave family. Their testimony would carry weight with the governor." The marshal squinted at Ayanna. "You claim you're innocent of these killings?" "I do not claim. I am." Her voice carried the certainty of mountain stone. Talbot grunted, pocketing the locket. "Evidence against your band was never more than the lieutenants say. So, man's got a reputation for seeing Apache guilt wherever he looks." He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Might be time someone looked closer at these trappers." Silas watched the marshal draft a telegram to the territorial governor. "You're taking a considerable risk, Marshal. Wearing this badge means something more than pleasing folk who shout loudest." Talbot sealed the envelope. "Besides, got word yesterday about similar attacks. Same trapper's description. Patterns clear as day to anyone willing to see it." The door burst open with a crack like lightning striking a pine. Lieutenant Trent stood framed in the doorway, flanked by 2 soldiers with rifles at the ready. His immaculate uniform seemed out of place amidst the dust and grime of frontier life, but the wild look in his eyes belonged to the territory's harshest elements. "Marshal Talbot," he nodded curtly, "I see you've apprehended the Apache woman. My men will take custody." "That won't be happening, Lieutenant." Talbot remained seated, one hand resting casually near his holster. "New evidence has come to light." The lieutenant's face hardened. "Evidence? What sort of Apache lies have you been fed?" His gaze fell on Ayanna with a hatred that seemed to suck the air from the room. "She's responsible for 6 deaths. Justice demands truth," Silas interrupted, stepping between them despite the wound in his side pulling tight. "She has a name, Ayanna, and truth deserves hearing." "Step aside, Boone. Harboring a murderer makes you equally guilty." Marshal Talbot rose slowly, unfolding to his full height. "Lieutenant Trent, your pursuit is officially unsanctioned, pending the governor's investigation." He placed the telegram on the counter. "These are my orders as territorial law enforcement." "Your authority ends where military matters begin," Trent snarled, hand dropping to his sidearm. Quicker than thought, Talbot's revolver appeared. "That gesture constitutes threatening a law officer. You're under arrest for obstructing justice and exceeding your authority." For a heartbeat, the room balanced on a knife's edge. Then the lieutenant's second soldier lowered his rifle, unwilling to die for his commander's obsession. The crowd that had gathered traders, a few settlers, even a cavalry private who'd slipped in, watched in silence as Talbot relieved the lieutenant of his weapon. Ayanna moved forward, her steps measured and deliberate. She pulled aside the collar of her shirt to reveal a jagged scar across her shoulder. "The man who killed the settler woman left this mark when I fought him," she said, voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "It was made by a knife with a notched blade, the same knife Esteban saw in the trapper's possession." The private nodded slowly. "I've seen that knife. Belongs to a trapper named Walsh who comes to the fort." Something shifted in the room then, like the first ice cracking on a frozen river. Faces that had regarded Ayanna with suspicion now carried uncertainty, perhaps even shame. As night fell across the territory, Marshal Talbot locked the lieutenant in the trading post's small cellar storeroom. He returned to where Silas and Ayanna waited by the dying fire. "You've got temporary vindication," he told them, voice low. But the territory remains dangerous. Too many believe what they wish, regardless of truth. Silas looked to Ayanna, a silent question passing between them. Continue toward the border where new lives awaited, or trust this fragile justice system that had already failed her people once before. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward like prayers to an indifferent sky. The small pine and hide cabin nestled beside the Rio Sonora, like it had grown there natural as the mesquite trees. Smoke curled peaceful from the stone chimney, rising straight in the still Mexican air. 8 months had passed since they'd crossed the border, each day adding another thin layer of belonging to this place that had no memory of bloodshed between their peoples. Ayanna sat beneath the sprawling mesquite, needle flashing in the dappled sunlight as she stitched together small garments from soft rabbit hide. Her gaze drifted regularly to where Silas worked with a wild mustang in the corral downslope. The stallion pranced and snorted, tossing its black mane while Silas spoke low words that carried no meaning save their tone of patience. Inside their home stood no trophies of conquest, only bundles of herbs hanging from rafters, a worn Bible on the table, a half-finished child's blanket draped across a chair, and the wooden horse carving now painted with Apache symbols of protection and new beginnings. "Ayanna," Silas called, voice carrying over the soft burble of the river. He approached with an envelope in hand, trail dust still clinging to his boots. Trader brought this from across the border. She took the letter, fingers tracing the official territorial seal before breaking it open. Her eyes widened as she read aloud. Lieutenant Trent received dishonorable discharge. The trappers confessed before execution. Your band has been granted official pardon. Silas settled beside her on the bench they'd built together, shoulder pressing gently against hers. "There's more," he said. "The cottonwood," she continued reading, voice softening. "The one where you found me. Territorial order had it cut down. The wood was used to build a schoolhouse, where Apache children now learn alongside settlers." The river chattered over stones below them, speaking its own language of continuance. Silas reached up absently, touching the ridge of scar tissue along his side, where the lieutenant's bullet had torn through flesh that night of their escape. "You said they hung you hoping anyone who cared would walk into bullet," he said, the memory no longer carrying its sharp edge. His mouth softened into a smile that remained rare but genuine when it appeared. "Glad I was too stubborn to die." Later that evening, Ayanna led Silas down to the river's edge, where moonlight painted silver paths across the water. She knelt beside a small arrangement of stones she'd gathered from upstream, each bearing markings she'd carefully etched. "My mother," she said, touching the first stone. "My father, my brother. The river carries their names south now, but the stones remain." Beside this memorial stood a wooden sign, not crude like the one that had hung above her in the cottonwood, but lovingly crafted from mesquite wood. Both Apache symbols and English words adorned its surface. "Here 2 rivers meet." Silas ran calloused fingers over the carving, understanding its meaning beyond mere waters joining. The next morning, Ayanna stood barefoot in the shallows, hands resting on the swell of her belly beneath her dress. The child within kicked strongly against her palm as she whispered, "Your father didn't just forgive, he loved, and kept his word when others would have broken theirs." Silas joined her at the water's edge, boots discarded on the bank. Their hands found each other without looking, fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of those who've faced death together and chosen life instead. The sunset painted the Rio Sonora gold around their ankles, water flowing ever onward like the frontier itself, unceasing, unforgiving, yet occasionally offering unexpected blessings to those brave enough to see beyond differences. The frontier forges unlikely bonds when brave hearts recognize truth beneath differences. When a man cuts down what others would leave hanging, when a woman trusts what experience tells her to fear, such courage transforms strangers into family against the wild backdrop of our nation's untamed past.